Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the very best in college football conversation, discussion, and debate. We bring you analysis just about every day from the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry, and also from myself. Tonight, we've got old friend Mike McDaniel on the line. You can join him at College Football Saturday. That's cfb-saturday.com. He's also got himself a podcast along with Joey Weaver. Basketball Conference Podcast. It's a football-oriented podcast, but it's oriented there in the ACC Basketball Conference Podcast with Joey Weaver. Mike, how you doing tonight?
Hey, how's it going, Mark? It's been a while.
Yeah, I know it. You've been working hard, so hopefully we're going to ask you to work hard for us tonight, do some heavy lifting with what's one of the fun topics in the offseason. It's projecting win totals against the odds. So if you go to Bet Online, those are the numbers that we're using for this over-under discussion on college football future projections for 2018. So, Mike, as you scan the board, what teams are jumping out to you?
So there are 5, and we'll kind of go through these one by one, and you and I can kind of go back and forth team by team. So the first one that stood out to me, I'm a Virginia Tech Hokies alum. So Virginia Tech, according to betonline.ag, is sitting at an over-under of 7.5, and I think they could easily hit the over on this. Now, I guess it's important to note right off the top, these are regular season win totals, so obviously not including any bowl game victories or losses in this discussion. You look at the Virginia Tech schedule this year, there are 3 games that stand out to you when looking at the football schedule. You have Florida State on the road on Labor Day to open up the season. That's a toss-up game, in my opinion. You got Florida State. Questions at quarterback, it's either going to be DeAndre Francois or it's going to be James Blackman. The questions surrounding Francois relate to his injury and how he's recovered from it after suffering a season-ending injury to his leg in the opener last year against Alabama, and B, he's under investigation as part of there was a marijuana sting, and he was busted for drugs about a month and a half ago now. So there are issues there at Florida State that they're hammering out there with DeAndre Francois at quarterback, but assume he's healthy and assume he's the guy. Florida State is a really good football team with him at the helm. In addition, you have all the questions with the new coaching staff. How is Willie Taggart going to adapt in his new role there at Florida State right off the bat? How good are they going to be right away? This is not a Florida State team that's a preseason top 5 or even top 10 team like they've been in the last couple of seasons, but I think Florida State is going to be in a position where they're a top 15 or 20 team when the season opens. So that's a tough game for Virginia Tech right off the top. They also host Notre Dame as a non-conference game this year in early October. It's their first game of October, actually, and that'll be a very, very difficult matchup for Virginia Tech, but they do get that game at home. There's also the Miami game in November, which could end up deciding the Coastal Division, much like it did last year. So those are the 3 games for Virginia Tech that I think could swing the schedule one way or another, but the over-under for the Hokies is sitting at 7.5. So even if Virginia Tech loses those 3 games and then drops a random conference game, like they seem to do, if not every year, every other year, whether it be a team like Georgia Tech or on the road at Pittsburgh, where Virginia Tech has historically struggled, there might be a game in there in the conference schedule that not many people are predicting Virginia Tech to lose that they could end up losing. But even so, you take the 3 tough games and then the 1 random game that they might drop in conference play, and you still have an 8-4 season for the Hokies. So I would take the over there for Virginia Tech, sitting at 7.5. I feel pretty comfortable with the team that they're bringing back, even though there are a lot of question marks in their secondary. They do have a lot of rotational guys who are returning back into the fold. Divine Diablo at safety is going to come back. He's going to replace Terrell Edmonds in all likelihood. He played a bit last year before suffering a season-ending injury. You still have Adonis Alexander at corner. You still have Mook Reynolds, who can line up in the slot at corner. He's listed as their whip, but he's a really strong player. And they have Devin Hunter, who was a 4-star or 5-star recruit, depending on where you looked, 2 years ago. Got a lot of his playing time last year on special teams. He's ready to step into a safety role for the Hokies. So they still have a lot of talent returning on the defensive side of the football. They have Josh Jackson returning on offense and a lot of young playmakers on the outside. So Virginia Tech's still going to have a talented team, even though on the surface they are replacing a lot of starters. So I'd like them to go over mark at 7.5.
So you definitely have levels of teams. So you go to the high end and you've got the small collection of elite teams. Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, etc. Very, very small group there. And then you've got your different tiers of teams. And then when you look at, and then of course at the very bottom of the barrel, and you don't even necessarily factor them into the equation when looking at this, because we're generally looking at teams in this particular case that are going to win more games than they lose. So we're assuming a number of wins and have to in this exercise. But I tend to group games together. So instead of not necessarily looking at every game and making a prediction on win or loss, I tend to do it a sense what you just did there, Mike, and look at potential losses. So for Virginia Tech, it appears as though there's really nobody on their schedule that you're going to say, okay, they're going to lose for sure. They're playing Alabama. They're losing that game 90% of the time. They could beat everybody on their schedule. Will they win all those games? Most likely not. But then there's that collection of teams. There's a couple teams that most likely they're going to lose, or they're going to lose 2 out of 4, as you mentioned, or 1 out of 3, or 2 out of 3. So is there a collection of teams that possibly put a wrench in this theory of surpassing the 7.5? And so that's what I'm looking for. How good is the Coastal Division? So I'm thinking Miami is clearly the best roster. Virginia Tech's most likely the second best team, and they're almost by themselves unless something changes or shows me otherwise this year. There's almost like a Miami line, a Virginia Tech line, and then there's just, my goodness, everybody else is mixed up to some degree. So out of those, that collection of that muck in the Coastal Division, are there teams that could jump up and scare them, like Virginia or Georgia Tech, I guess, would be the best possibility of jumping up and doing something there. But so the teams that would scare me would be Georgia Tech, and then in addition to Florida State, which I would consider in Tallahassee to be maybe a 70-30 Florida State proposition. The other team that would scare me would be Boston College, based on what they showed us this past season in beating some pretty good football teams, and also that that they are projected to be pretty good again this fall.
Yeah, Boston College is a team that's really interesting to watch because they really found something halfway through last season with the running game. You saw the emergence of A.J. Dillon. Whether or not Scott Loeffler goes back to that is a whole nother question. He was the offensive coordinator of Virginia Tech, and he had a tendency to kind of fall in love with his scheme and not necessarily what was working 100% of the time. If that went against his scheme, so A.J. Dillon is a good example. Scott Loeffler likes to spread it out and throw the ball quite a bit. And Boston College historically, really since Matt Ryan, has not had a great quarterback. So they have to lean on that running game. Well, if Scott Loeffler falls in love with the passing game again and doesn't give A.J. Dillon the touches that I think he deserves, you find yourself in a situation where how good is Boston College going to be? Will they reach their peak win projection? I think if they give the ball to A.J. Dillon, this is a 7 or 8 win football team pretty easily. If they don't, I think there's a few games in there that they probably should win that they won't. So Boston College is an interesting team. That's always a game that Virginia Tech kind of needs to watch out for because Boston College historically has a really good defense. So they'll give Virginia Tech a run for their money for sure. The one other game that scares me that you mentioned is Georgia Tech. Now for Virginia Tech, they do get that game at home, which is to their benefit. But I think Georgia Tech is one of the most talented teams in the Coastal Division. I think it's Miami, Virginia Tech, and Georgia Tech are the three that you watch for year after year. Georgia Tech let a lot of games slip away last year. They're going to have a better defense under Nate Woody now that Ted Roof's gone. It's a different scheme. They're running a 3-4 now. I think that'll be to their benefit. They have a lot of attacking linebackers on that roster, so I think Georgia Tech's going to be a good team. And Pittsburgh is not supposed to be that good heading into 2018, but Pittsburgh's a team that historically has owned Virginia Tech at Heinz Field, and Virginia Tech goes to play them at Heinz Field once again. The Hokies won for the first time ever at Heinz Field 2 years ago. And that was a slugfest going back and forth, and Pat Narduzzi made an ass of himself, and that was a huge story nationally because of how he was screaming at the refs, and that was a Thursday night game, and things got really weird. I expect the Hokies to be favored in that game rather heavily, but those games at Heinz Field always get really weird, and I think the Hokies need to be careful because it's historically a place where they have struggled.
Mike McDaniel joining us from College Football Saturday. That's CFB Saturday. Mike joins us on a regular basis to discuss college football. Please join him on Twitter as well, Mike McDaniel, CFB. You can catch his podcast with Joey Weaver. We miss seeing Joey, miss his coverage of Georgia Tech football, but Joey's still involved with college football coverage with Mike on Basketball Conference Podcast. Just look that up as well, or just join Mike on his Twitter page where it's posted there. And when I see it, Mike, I retweet every time. So I will do that more faithfully in the future. But really enjoy the conversations you and Joey have, bringing on some top-notch guests as well. As an aside to our discussion with Virginia Tech and the win total over-under, and if you're following along there, we're referencing Bet Online. So that's your reference point for the wins total in the future betting. But what makes the situation with Virginia Tech and Miami being the chief competitors there in the Coastal Division for me is that they're playing the same conference schedule this year. So this rarely happens. Virginia Tech's rival, in quotes, I'll put it, because I don't think they're a main rival, but the team that they're assigned to play each and every year out of the other division in the Atlantic is Boston College. Well, it so happens that the rotation comes up that Virginia Tech's playing Florida State as well as their other opponent in the Atlantic, albeit Miami always plays Florida State. And this year, the rotation comes up that they're playing Boston College. So it may come down to the situation of Miami going to Blacksburg to take on Virginia Tech, and that being the deciding factor because nobody has an advantage in who they play or don't play, i.e. a Clemson versus a Syracuse in the other division. It's fair and square with BC and Florida State, the two opponents for both teams in the other division.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting there to see how the Hokies really adapt to the situation this year, because it's going to be very similar to what they faced last year when they went on the road to Miami to essentially decide the Coastal Division. The Hokies got blown out of the stadium. So they're going to have to play better in this year's matchup. I think having the game in Blacksburg will do a lot for them, having the momentum on your side, having the home crowd, having Miami come to Lane Stadium with Malik Rozier, who is known for making questionable decisions in the pocket. You go into a tough road environment, you never know how he's going to react. But Miami has a really talented team. They're odds-on Coastal Division favorites. So that'll be a huge game in Blacksburg. At least it's setting up that way with how the schedule looks right now.
So, Mike, you're catching some flack from Martin Rosario, who is calling your podcast the Miami Hate Podcast, so forth and so on. So let's clarify something here. Mike loves Virginia Tech. He is an alum of Virginia Tech. He's not hiding his allegiance to his school. Look at college football analysts across the board, whether it be myself or anybody, Kirk Herbstreit and the like. They love their school. They root for their school. They separate their allegiance to their school and their rooting interest from their analysis of the field. Mike does that very well himself. Commented before we started to record tonight that Miami has one of the best rosters in the country. There you go. I think we all can understand in watching Malik Rozier play the entirety of last season and specifically the final 3 games of last season against quality opponents, that comes very much into question when determining whether Miami can take a next step is the quarterback play. And if he's under center or in the quarterback position, that's going to come under question as to which Miami is going to have to overcome, or he's going to have to be markedly improved for them to take the next step.
Yeah, and he's heading to his redshirt senior season. He hasn't really improved yet. He was obviously backing up Brad Kaya, and then he wasn't very good last year. And, in my opinion, he's going to be the reason why Miami doesn't make the college football playoff this upcoming season. It's because he's going to make a mistake in a big game, or he's going to make a mistake in a game that, whether it be a team like Georgia Tech or a team like Virginia Tech, a team that Miami probably should beat, Malik Rozier is going to have one of those down games. In the 3 losses last year, Malik Rozier didn't even complete 45% of his passes. So, it's not even the losses, though. It's, some of the wins that they essentially pulled a rabbit out of the hat. There were a couple of games in there where he didn't play very well then either. Rozier is an interesting guy. I mean, he's got the experience. He's familiar with the offense. Mark Richt trusts him, but whether that's enough for Miami to get to the college football playoff remains to be seen. But in my opinion, I think there's a pretty defined ceiling with Malik Rozier at the quarterback position, and I believe that that's about 8 or 9 wins. I think that they're due to lose another 3 or 4 games with him at quarterback this year, just because they're extremely limited in the passing game. If we see the same Malik Rozier that we saw last year.
Get Mike McDaniel on the line from College Football Saturday. That's cfb-saturday.com. Also catch his podcast, Basketball Conference Podcast with Joey Weaver. All right, Mike, who's on deck? Who are we looking at next?
Let's stay in the ACC. The odds-on favorite to win the entire conference, returning one of the most talented rosters in all of college football, the Clemson Tigers. Now, their over-under is set at 10.5. When looking at Clemson's roster, I don't think there's a roster on paper, in my opinion anyway, that can compete with this football team. There are a couple that are pretty close. I think Ohio State has a very good roster. Alabama, obviously, each and every year as well. But outside of that, there aren't many teams this year that has a roster that I would put ahead of Clemson's, at least at the outset. If there's one position, and we just talked about this with Miami a little bit, if there's one position in all of college football that can impact a team's ability to win football games over any other, it's the quarterback. And Clemson has a luxury in that, Kelly Bryant was statistically one of the best quarterbacks in college football last season. He received a lot of flack because there were some issues that he had in the downfield passing game throughout the course of the season. They have Trevor Lawrence coming in. He's a true freshman, 5-star recruit, one of the top recruits in the country. He's coming in, had a really strong spring as an early enrollee. They have Hunter Johnson, who was a 4-star recruit at quarterback who backed up Kelly Bryant last year. So while Clemson fans may look at the quarterback position and say, well, does Kelly Bryant give us the best chance to win? He's inherently limited in the passing game to a bit of a lesser degree than Malik Rozier, but he's limited in the passing game. Does he give us the best chance to win? Well, if Dabo Swinney decides to go in a different direction, he's got a ton of talent on the roster, to do so, whether it be Trevor Lawrence or Hunter Johnson. Clemson has options at the quarterback position that other schools across the country may not have when looking at replacing an incumbent starting quarterback. Clemson's defense, a lot of people expected a majority of their front seven to move on to the NFL. A lot of those guys decided to stay, which is huge for Clemson. They're returning most of their secondary, offensive line. They've had depth across the board for years now. A lot of those guys are returning. There are playmakers everywhere. Travis Etienne at running back, he's coming back. Another year of seasoning should do him well. So Clemson's absolutely loaded, and I say all that without even looking at their roster, without looking at their schedule. I'm sorry, and there are only a handful of I'd classify as tough games on their schedule. They go on the road to Florida State in October. That's a pretty tough game. Rivalry games get weird, so keep an eye on the November 24th game at the end of the year against South Carolina. But Clemson does get that game at home this year. They're at home against NC State October 20th, but I expect NC State to take a step back this year. Losing the talent that they lost on the outside with Jalen Samuels. They don't have Naheem Hines anymore. Obviously, Bradley Chubb on defense. So NC State's got holes to fill on both sides of the football. Clemson goes on the road to Georgia Tech rather early in the season in September. They also go on the road in the second week of the season to Texas A&M. But Clemson should be favored in every single game they play. I'd say by probably a touchdown. And we'll see when the lines actually come out. They go week by week. But this Clemson team is extremely talented. They're hungry. They want to build upon the college football semifinal loss that they had last year to Alabama. I know they'd love to get back to the college football playoff, and I think a lot of people are expecting him to. So it'll be really interesting to see what Clemson does, but the over-under is a 10.5, and I have no reason to think that Clemson will lose 2 games when looking at this schedule, at least in the regular season. I just don't see it. I think they're far too talented. I think the teams that they're playing, specifically in the Atlantic Division with the teams that I mentioned, with NC State, Florida State, another team in Louisville that you're looking at, all 3 of those teams, in my opinion, are going to take a step back from where they were last year, at least talent-wise. I know Florida State ended up having a down year with the loss of DeAndre Francois. But overall, I think the ACC Atlantic takes a step back this year. I think Clemson is the class, not only of the division, but of the conference. I think that'll show through on their schedule. I don't think they'll have any trouble barring major injuries across the board. Something like North Carolina had last year where they lost like, I don't know, 23 or 24 rotational players to injury. Barring anything like that, I think Clemson should easily get to 11 wins at the very least heading into the season. And I think at worst they lose 2 games, then they hit the under, and then it's, all hell's broken loose, and they're not even going to a college football playoff. So I expect the Tigers to be really good. I mean, they're really talented. The schedule sets up nicely for them. They got a ton of players returning and a ton of playmakers. And Dabo Swinney is a head coach. He's proven time and time again that he can flat out recruit and he can flat out coach. He's one of the best in the business, and I trust him over almost anybody in college football. So I think Clemson can easily get to 11 wins.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the very best in college football conversation, discussion, and debate with the likes of Mike McDaniel from College Football Saturday. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation. Like my Facebook page as well at Mark Rogers TV. Right now, we have fired up the live stream with Mike McDaniel. We're taking your comments and questions at the live chat on YouTube. And also just a few minutes ago, I fired up Facebook as well. Why not? I forget about Facebook, and I can't be ignoring 2.3 billion people on Facebook. So we need to pay more attention to the Facebook Live option, and we'll do that clearly in the future. So we're taking your comments and questions. Mike McDaniel running down his projection on college football futures, meaning the projection of win totals for college football teams across the country. Our reference tonight is Bet Online. You can go right there, look at the same wins totals that we're looking at. Keep in mind that there's an odds projection as well. So if you don't understand the betting game and the projection of wins totals and the number that you see on the right, which is reference to the money line, the number that you see after the plus and minus, I'm not going to explain all of that right now, but the win totals, those projections are somewhat slanted by the odds that they put and the money payout for the over-under as well. So Mike has talked about Clemson, Miami, and Virginia Tech. Mike, anybody else out there that you've got your eye on?
Yeah, we got a few here. Let's jump over to Big 12 with Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a really interesting team, right? Because their over-under here is set at 10.5. I think that's rather high. I personally would be taking the under on 10.5. I'll probably bet this, quite honestly, if I get these odds on the site that I bet with. But Oklahoma is sitting at 10.5. I'm taking the under there. The reason why is because Baker Mayfield pulled the rabbit out of the hat in multiple games last year, and they had a couple of games where there were opportunities to be upset, and Oklahoma they pulled it out late. Baker Mayfield was an outstanding player for them, won the Heisman Trophy, ended up being the #1 pick to the Cleveland Browns. He's an outstanding college player. We'll see how he does in the pros. They're replacing him with Kyler Murray, who in limited action has been very good for Oklahoma over the last couple of seasons. The Sooners will be really good. They're the best team in the Big 12, in my opinion. But I feel like the over-under 10.5 is a little bit strong. They have a lot of tricky games here this upcoming season. They have a home game against UCLA in week 2. UCLA is obviously replacing Josh Rosen. They have a new head coach as Jim Mora has departed. So UCLA, new coaching staff, new quarterback. Oklahoma should win that football game, especially since it's at home in Norman. That's a game to watch out for. They go on the road to Iowa State. Those Big 12 games get weird, especially at Iowa State. You go to any of the Iowas, right? So you go to at Iowa State, or you go over to the Big 10, you go on the road to Iowa, and those games get super weird. Keep an eye on that Iowa State game. Oklahoma should be probably a 10 to 14 point favorite in that football game, but that has a tendency to get a little bit weird. They have the Cotton Bowl. They played the Red River Shootout in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas against Texas. Keep an eye on that game in October. Also on the road to TCU, home against Kansas State, and at West Virginia to close the season. So there are some tough games here in conference play on Oklahoma's schedule this year. I think Oklahoma could easily lose 2 or 3 of these games, and they could be tough games that go down to the wire like they have in recent years, but there are a few teams in there that I have a feeling could knock off Oklahoma if Kyler Murray makes a couple of mistakes that a young starter would make at the quarterback position. Oklahoma's defense was pretty good throughout a majority of last season. They were at least the best defense in the Big 12. in my opinion, as far as the turnovers that they forced and how they played just overall. It's a pretty weak conference defensively, so there are obviously a lot of points being scored there. But keep an eye on Oklahoma. I have the under 10.5 there just because what they're losing on the offensive side of the football. I think the loss of Baker Mayfield really is a lot to overcome, even though their fans and their coaching staff feel really, really good about Kyler Murray and his ability. I think there are too many tough games on the schedule this year. Texas is going to be much improved. Kansas State is always well coached. You're going to TCU and on the road to West Virginia to close the year. West Virginia is returning Will Grier, quarterback. They can score a ton of points. I just feel better about the under here if I'm betting on the Oklahoma win total. So I'm taking under 10.5 there.
So, Mike, we talked about the collection of teams, meaning for Oklahoma and for me and projecting a win total. I don't see anybody that's necessarily better on their schedule. I don't see, like we saw Ohio State as a non-conference game the last 2 years, and specifically when they routed Oklahoma 2 years ago in Norman and were the better team. And they also lost to Houston that particular season. So Oklahoma should be better than everyone on their schedule, but that doesn't mean you bring your best each and every week. So I'm looking at the odds or the probabilities that they're going to win those games. So I think you can collect out of the Big 12, which is a better conference than it was just 2 or 3 years ago. You can collect a number of teams that on a given Saturday has a good shot at beating Oklahoma. Those teams are TCU, West Virginia, Texas, certainly, Oklahoma State, of course. Kansas State is in that mix as well. Texas, in particular, playing that game in a neutral site at the Cotton Bowl, if they can figure out the quarterback situation, and I would give Tom Herman much credit in getting more out of the quarterback position than he has in his first season at Texas between Sam Ehlinger and Shane Buechele. If he can figure that out, choose the right guy, put the offense in place for that particular player, because Ehlinger's the runner, the tough kid, the one that wants to turn the corner and take on the linebacker. Buechele, a little bit more cerebral, makes the right decisions, better passing quarterback. If they make the right choice there and could tailor the offense to the particular quarterback of choice, Texas could be a dark horse for the college football playoff this season, and I believe that they could make a run. Consider that even with Baker Mayfield and all those weapons on the field that came that close to playing in the national championship game, Texas played them toe-to-toe within a score at the Cotton Bowl last season. So Oklahoma has a string of games like that this year with the likes of Texas, Oklahoma State, TCU, Kansas State, and Iowa State, as Mike points out. Mike, I don't know if you want to go outside the lines of some of the teams that you're tabbing, but we're getting all sorts of suggestions here from the chat on YouTube. I also have the chat pulled up on Facebook as well. Appreciate you people joining us on Facebook. If I don't respond, it means that I'm looking at the chat on YouTube, the chat on Facebook. I'm talking and directing the show all at the same time. And basically what it comes down to on my Facebook, because I've pulled it up on the iPhone, is I just can't read that far. So that's what the deal is here. So let's go to a number of people that want our suggestions and our projections on a number of teams here. So I'll throw out, Mike, Notre Dame, the over-under there, and your thoughts in looking at the Notre Dame schedule. I'll give you a second to do that, and you can keep in your back pocket Ohio State at, again, it depends on your service. So we're looking at Bet Online that has Ohio State. So this is a good example. Ohio State at 9.5. If you go to most services, you're going to see the Buckeyes at 10.5 wins. And they play with the money payout is the way that and the service is always going to try to skew it in a direction that they're going to make the betting public lean one way or the other, and then skew the payout in the other direction. So we'll tee you up, Mike, for Notre Dame.
Yeah, Notre Dame's sitting at 8.5, according to Bet Online, and they have a very tough schedule, as they do most years. Now they have a lot of talent returning on both sides of the football. They do need to replace, obviously, 2 All-Americans on the offensive line, Mike McGlinchey and Quentin Nelson. You have spotty quarterback play with Brandon Wimbush throughout most of last season. It'll be interesting to see how he plays here with another year of development. It's anticipated that he'll be the starter. I know he was replaced in some of the games in the latter half of the season, but I fully anticipate him to end up being the starter here, and you know, hopefully taking a step forward for Notre Dame because they have a very tough schedule. They have Michigan right off the bat at home. That's a tough game. It's a 50-50 game. Michigan's going to be very talented once again. It'll be interesting to see what they do offensively heading into the year. I know that's a question that a lot of Michigan fans want answered. Notre Dame hosts Stanford this year. They go on the road to Blacksburg to play Virginia Tech. They have Florida State at home, and they go on the road to USC. 8.5. That's a tricky line. I anticipate Notre Dame probably drops 2 out of those 5 games I just mentioned, whether it be Michigan, Stanford, Virginia Tech, Florida State, or USC. All the other games on their schedule are very winnable. They have Ball State and these are all non-conference games, obviously, but they have Ball State, Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, Pitt at home. They play Navy in a road game this year. But it always ends up it's a neutral site somewhere, either Philadelphia or Baltimore. They go to Northwestern, which is a tricky game in early November, but Notre Dame should be favored there. Notre Dame hosts Syracuse this year as well. That's a really powerful offense, especially with Eric Dungey at quarterback. So 8.5 is it's tough. I think I would lean over here for Notre Dame. I anticipate that they'll probably get through that tough 5-game slate with at least 3 wins. And I think if they do, you're looking at a 10-2 season and potentially a New Year's Six bowl game, given the schedule that they have. But a very tough schedule for Notre Dame. I would stay away from the win total entirely. I'm not going to be betting on it, whether it's 8.5. I've seen 9.5 some places too. I'd completely stay away from it. I think Notre Dame is as talented as almost any team in college football heading into next season. They're going to be a top 10 or 12 team heading into the year, but it's a really tough schedule and a tough ask, as it always is when you're Notre Dame and you schedule independently. It's going to be a very, very tough schedule, especially when you play Michigan right off the bat. Even though that game is in South Bend, Michigan's not going to be a slouch this year. I think they'll be better on offense, and you never know with Stanford, USC, and then you have Florida State and Virginia Tech. I'm staying away from betting on Notre Dame entirely this year, but I think if I had to lean one way or the other, I would take the over on Notre Dame. I think they should get to 9, maybe 10 wins next season.
So let's make a distinction right here, and Mike knows exactly what I'm talking about here when I make a distinction between making wins projections and just saying flat out, okay, I think Notre Dame's going to go over 8.5. I don't really like making that play, but if somebody holds a gun to my head, I'm going to go with the over, versus actually looking at what the odds are and what the payout is, the over versus the under. Because if you make a number of plays on these win projections and they don't pay out at least 50-50, you can, let's say, hit 4 out of 6, but because the service provider, Bet Online in this particular case, is not paying out 50-50, then you're a loser. Versus you can play it the other way and you can maybe hit 3 of 6 and be a winner. Again, we're not going to go into the numbers and the payouts and everything. We're just playing the college football game of who's going to go over and who's going to go over or under. Ohio State's generally a 10.5. Again, we're referencing Bet Online. They've got the Buckeyes at 9.5. So what they're doing there is they've got a low payout because they've dropped it by a game. It's 9.5. They got a low payout if you take the over. They got a higher payout if you take the under. Because most likely the Buckeyes are going to play over the 9.5. Martin Rosario talking about Ohio State being painfully overrated in recent years, save for 2014. All right, Mike, I'll take this real quick.
As an Ohio State fan, it's all yours.
Let's understand something here. Yes, Ohio State has been very well rated. But if you would look at the wins projections and if you would look at the initial ranking in the preseason poll versus what Ohio State and Urban Meyer have accomplished since he took over in 2012, it's pretty close. The man's 73-8. Nick Saban has 8 losses in the same time frame. They both have 8 losses. That's not even approached by any other program going back to 2012. Clemson over the last few years. So he's 73-8. Even in a underperforming year of, let's say, 2015, when they were the consensus number 1 for most of the season and lost by a last-second field goal to a Michigan State team that won the Big Ten and went to the college football playoff, they still went 12-1 and finished number 4 in the country, and they were painfully overrated that year. So let's understand it that they have been in national title consideration and contention every year since Urban Meyer stepped on campus. Every year they have been playing late games in November with a national championship within their grasp. So they really haven't been that overrated. Okay, Mike, whether you want to take a shot at Ohio State at 9.5 or 10.5, go right to it.
Let's start with the 9.5, and with Bet Online, you're not getting great odds. I think it's -145 for the over 9.5 for Ohio State. I mean, not great odds because I do anticipate them hitting the over on 9.5. 10.5 could get a little dicey just because I look at their schedule and there are games in here that they could potentially lose on the road at Penn State. That could be a tough game. Indiana seems to play a handful of teams tough every year. Ohio State gets that game at home. They should be okay first week of October. That's just a game to keep an eye on if you're looking for a flyer on a conference game that Ohio State's going to be heavily favored in. That could get a little bit weird. I'd keep an eye on that. Ohio State goes on the road to Michigan State November 10th, and they host Michigan in the big game November 24th to close out the season. You know, there are 2 or 3 games in there that if you're looking at the over under a 10.5, I might lean under and just hedge my bets and say, okay, you know, maybe a 10-2 season, just given who they're scheduled against in games I think they could potentially lose. But Ohio State's as talented as anybody. And I think they'll be solid on offense. Their defense will be really good once again. I know they're replacing some guys on both sides of the football, some key contributors there on both sides of the ball. But I think Ohio State will be very good once again this year. I think you can shoe them in, honestly, for 10 wins and feel pretty good about it. But if you want to take the odds on them going over 10.5, it depends on what kind of odds you're getting. I think they can get there. I think anywhere in the 10 or 11 win range is a pretty comfortable range for Ohio State to be in. I think regardless, the win totals notwithstanding, Ohio State's going to be playing meaningful games in November and games that have college football playoff implications. So you have to feel really good about where Ohio State's at once again heading into the 2018 season. I would lean over on the 9.5. I wouldn't touch the 10.5 personally, but it depends on what kind of odds you're getting, of course, on these. And at -145, our odds aren't great in your favor here using Bet Online with the 9.5 win total going over, but I feel really comfortable with them going over, and that's why the odds aren't that great.
All right. Yes, Nick Saban never got blown out by Iowa or by Clemson. We'll pardon the grammar there. But yeah, Nick Saban never got blown out by Iowa or Clemson. I don't believe Nick Saban has played Iowa. Yes, they played Clemson last year. They did win the game after splitting those first 2 matchups. What's the point? I guess the point would be that Urban Meyer did lose to Clemson and did lose to Iowa. Yeah, they played different teams. Nick Saban has lost 2 years in a row to Ole Miss. So we can continue this back and forth. All right. We also have Michigan, Mike. I don't know if you've got those numbers handy. I believe the over-unders at 8.5, and the Wolverines, and you touched upon this in looking at Notre Dame, their schedule off the top of my head, Mike, is brutal. So they play in what is not necessarily the best division in college football, but it's most likely the best top half of a division in college football themselves. Michigan State, Penn State, and the aforementioned Ohio State. It's about as tough as it gets. And then we also talked about Wisconsin, or will be, and Michigan plays Wisconsin, and then they've got the Notre Dame game outside of conference. So there's a number of very difficult games for Michigan, and I expect the Wolverines to be very good. I don't know if the record's necessarily going to reflect it, but the roster's very good, and they've got Shea Patterson now at quarterback, and maybe Wolverine fans are overrating him just a bit, but here's a kid that's projected to be a top 5 pick in the NFL draft and has played well against SEC defenses. So I think they're going to be much improved at quarterback, but the schedule's brutal, and the defense is going to be really good. They've got wide receivers that were recruited very highly that just didn't have a chance last year without quarterback play, and we'll see if they're ready to take Michigan to the next level. So, Mike, what do you have for the Wolverines?
Yeah, I think Shea Patterson adds an entirely different dimension to Michigan. The fact that he transfers in, he's going to be immediately eligible. he looks like he's going to be a starting quarterback. That adds an entirely new dynamic to the Michigan offense because they have struggled with the quarterback position the last few years. Um, quite honestly, since Bernard Robinson left. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Michigan. I think Shea Patterson holds the keys to this entire season for Michigan. They go on the road in South Bend. We just talked about that. You got Wisconsin and Michigan State back-to-back weeks, one at home being Wisconsin, then one on the road in East Lansing against Michigan State in consecutive weeks in October. That could very well decide the season right there for Michigan in those two games. Then they have a bye week. Then they have a home game. They host Penn State. They go on the road to Ohio State at the end of the year. The schedule's absolutely brutal, like you mentioned. We looked at 5 games right there off the top. I think Michigan could lose at least 3 of those games. That puts them at 9 wins. Could they lose another game in the conference schedule, whether it be on the road at Northwestern, home against Nebraska, Indiana? We mentioned in the discussion about Ohio State, Indiana always plays a big team or two within the conference tough every year. Could the Michigan game be the one that Indiana steals in Ann Arbor? So there are a lot of games in here that, if I'm a Michigan fan, it doesn't necessarily give me pause. I think Michigan will be favored in a lot of these games, but you look at these games as possible losses, and that's all that you really care about when you're evaluating a win-loss total, like we mentioned earlier, Mark. The over-under for Michigan, you mentioned, was at 8.5. They're getting plus 115 odds on Bet Online for the under. They're minus 135 on the over. I think Michigan can get to 9 wins. This is one of these lines. Again, I want to emphasize this for everybody listening. There are lines that I look at that I'm giving a gut feeling on the over under, and then there are other lines where I feel great about what's going to happen. I don't feel great about the over under at 8.5 here for Michigan. I don't. I'm not going to bet it. If I had to lean one way or the other, I will lean over. I think Michigan can get to 9 wins, but I don't feel great about it. I wouldn't bet it. Michigan's going to be very good this year, but there are too many games on their schedule that are tricky, even though they get a lot of their tough games this year at home. There's too much uncertainty with this offense right now. Shea Patterson could be absolutely fantastic. He holds the keys to the entire season for the Wolverines. If he plays like a top 5 NFL draft pick, Michigan is a threat to win the Big Ten. They're a threat to win the Big Ten anyway, but when you have a quarterback coming in with potential, with some experience like Shea Patterson has, Michigan's got all the talent in the world. They've struggled at quarterback. Patterson holds the keys to the entire season. If he's great, Michigan can make it to a college football playoff. If he's not great, or if he's merely good, Michigan drops a couple of those games that we mentioned there. There are 5 really tough ones on their schedule. So I'm leaning on the 9, not touching it overall, just not betting them at all. Just leaving that win total alone.
Okay, folks, looking for us to make easy money for you. Let's calm down. Let's understand. Mike's been looking at this, and we want to point you to an article that he's working on for his site, College Football Saturday. So it's cfb-saturday.com. So he's putting some research into this and so forth. I'm responding completely off the top of my head, and now you guys are throwing out certain teams, and we love the discussion, and we'll offer our suggestions and our projections off the top of our head. But when you say Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, we haven't looked at it. We're just off the top of our head sitting here the second week of May looking at games. Michigan, consider this. We are looking at the games, taking Michigan specifically, looking at the games that they'll most likely lose or be in a 1-score game in, most likely. We also, as Mike pointed out a few minutes ago with Ohio State and Indiana, that if you take the teams that lost more than 1 game last season, so we're only eliminating 4 or 5 teams in the country, if that. And you look at the second tier of teams. Let's start with Ohio State being the best of the second tier last season, and Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, Clemson being that first tier. Everybody else most likely lost to somebody that they weren't supposed to lose to. So right off the top of my head, case in point, Ohio State, of course, lost to Iowa. TCU had a great season. They finished in the Big 12 championship game. They finished second in the conference standings during the regular season. They beat Stanford in a decent bowl game. They finished in the top 10 in the country. They lost to Iowa State. USC lost to Washington State, a team that they would beat 8 out of 10 times, but they lost to them on the road on a Friday night. We could go all the way through the really good teams. Michigan State lost to Northwestern. They beat Penn State. That was Penn State's loss to a team that wasn't quite as good as them. And on and on and on. So most teams, even if they finish as top 15 teams in the nation, they're going to lose 3 games. And one of those is going to be a game that we didn't anticipate. So Mike mentions the Indiana factor in the Big Ten, and Indiana has not been good. They basically made a bowl game 2 years ago with 6 losses, didn't make a bowl game this past season, but they have given Ohio State fits, and they've also given Michigan fits. They led them in the fourth quarter this past season. 2 years ago, they took them to double overtime. The year before, they had a 1-score game in the snow in Ann Arbor. Indiana has given them fits. Maryland's going to be a little bit better this year. Actually showed us something against Texas, and then they wilted. Their quarterbacks got hurt, but they were a team that's recruited in the top 15 in the nation the past 2 years. I think they need a few more classes to build on that, so it may not show on the field considerably, but in a given week with that kind of talent, maybe they jump up and win a game. It's a logjam in the Big Ten Western Division. After you get past Wisconsin being the elite team or close to an elite team, then you've got a logjam with the likes of Northwestern and Iowa, and Purdue was much better last season, and they should continue that trend. So it's an interesting take when you look at the odds and trying to project winners. So fill in. That's their handle. Fill in. Appreciate you jumping on board with a ton of comments here tonight. Looking at USC, and Mike, I believe that line was 7.5. So that's an interesting one to look at when you're talking about a very talented roster that plays in a weak division, but has a big question mark at quarterback, and they play 2 extremely difficult non-conference games.
Yeah, USC is a difficult one to handicap. We actually talked about this a little bit before we jumped on here tonight, Mark. JT Daniels, if he ends up being the quarterback for USC, as a highly touted true freshman, what does that offense look like with him at the quarterback position? Obviously, they don't have Deontay Burnett anymore. They don't have a guy to go to on the outside like him, and he was a very dynamic playmaker for them the last couple of years. But for a new quarterback stepping into an offense that, they will have a lot of playmakers. They're USC. They recruit well. But when you have a new, just an entirely new quarterback, forget the fact that he's a true freshman, just a new quarterback in a new system. What does that look like? USC's got a lot of tough games right off the bat. In September, we're going to learn a lot about how good the Trojans are. They're on the road at Stanford and on the road at Texas, 2 out of the first 3 weeks of the season. Not an easy game. Late September, they're at Arizona. Arizona's offense is a ton of fun to watch. Keep an eye on that game there in late September. USC has Notre Dame at the end of the year. They do get that game at home, which I think will be to their benefit. They're at UCLA. They're playing that game in the Rose Bowl. Keep an eye on that game as well. The over-under, like you mentioned, Mark, is set at 7.5. Plus 140 on the under, 7.5 for the Trojans. You're getting -1. What do we have? -160 on the over. I think USC should get to 7 or 8 wins. I'm not betting this either. There's a reason why we weren't planning to talk about these right off the bat. It's because I personally won't be betting USC 7.5. There's too much uncertainty there. You can make a lot of money on these types of bets, Mark, because there is so much uncertainty with these teams. But USC's got a really tough schedule. They got a lot of newcomers on both sides of the football. I anticipate USC will be moderately good. They'll make a bowl game. But I think anywhere from 6 to 9 wins is probably their sweet spot. If I had to guess, gun to my head, I'll say USC goes 8-4. They have a tough schedule. They got a lot of new guys. I think USC in 2019 is a team we're really going to watch as as probably the odds-on favorite in the Pac-12 and one of the teams that can threaten for a college football playoff. I think they're a couple years away. But this year will be all about getting JT Daniels' feet wet because I believe he's going to be a starting quarterback for USC. I don't know what Trojans fans thinks, but it'll be interesting to see what happens out there at USC. But I think 8-4 is a pretty safe bet. Gun to my head, but I could see them going 7-5 just because there is so much uncertainty on both sides of the football heading into 2018.
Yeah, so USC plays in a division that they are clearly the best team with the most talent, with the best roster, but they have those 2 games non-conference against Texas and against Notre Dame. They do get the Irish at home, but I believe Notre Dame will be a better team, at least out of the gate in week 1. Of course, that's a late season game, typically is Notre Dame USC. I haven't looked at the schedule. I believe it's still a late season game, Notre Dame USC. So Notre Dame USC, let's say they select, as they most likely will, JT Daniels at quarterback. They could get off to a rough start, be 2-2, let's say, at the end of September, and pull what they did 2 years ago with Sam Darnold at the helm, and then go on a run, pull everything together, and they're one of the top 5 to 10 teams. I don't think they're going to elevate to that type of position, but say a top 15 team at the end of the season, and maybe they beat Notre Dame. Maybe they're just a different team in week 10 than they were in week 1, and they're ready to take on the Irish. But Notre Dame's a better team right now than USC is. We saw that last season, and with the additions and subtractions from both rosters, I believe Notre Dame to still be decidedly a better team than USC. And it's such a narrow path for USC to get to that 8-win total, especially if, and I haven't checked, so any team in the Pac-12 plays everyone in their division, and they play 4 of the 6 teams in the other division. They only miss 2 teams in the conference. So if USC has to deal with both Washington, who's most likely the best team with the best roster in the conference, and Stanford, who's most likely the second best team, and they do play Stanford for sure, then it's going to be difficult because while they're the best team in their division, they're taking on 2 better teams there. They're taking on 2 better teams out of conference. And then that leaves you no air, meaning there's the collection of UCLA and the Arizona States and the Utahs that on a given week can certainly upset USC. So to Mike's point, it's a narrow path to get USC to 8 wins. I think most likely they'll do it because they'll probably pull off an upset because they're that talented elsewhere, but it's a tough call.
Yeah, don't bet it. I mean, if you want to really roll the dice, you just have to be really confident one way or another with USC, and I'm just not. I think my gut tells me they're too talented not to get to 8 wins, but then the flip side of it is, oh, well, you have a true freshman quarterback, potentially. You have holes on the outside you're replacing on offense at the skill positions at receiver. You got some guys you're replacing in the secondary and in the front 7. There are just too many uncertainties. You couple that with the fact they have a really devastating schedule out of the gate when you have Stanford and Texas 2 out of the first 3 weeks of the season. That's tough. So I'm staying away from this bet almost entirely.
Martin likes Washington to make the playoffs. I could certainly see that happening. The Huskies are in good shape with Jake Browning back at quarterback. They've got skill position players, Myles Gaskin back as well. And they do have an interesting affair with Auburn in week 1, one of those highly anticipated non-conference games that will give us a feel for how good those 2 teams are, whether they're just strong 9-3 type teams or whether they can make a push toward the playoff this season. Got Mike McDaniel on the line from College Football Saturday. You can join him at CFB-Saturday. Please join him on Twitter as well at Mike McDaniel ACC. It's at Mike McDaniel ACC. Sorry, Mike, I blew this, didn't I? Mike McDaniel CFB. See, I can't keep track of the iterations, but it's Mike McDaniel CFB, Mike McDaniel College Football. Join him on Twitter. And I always love the podcast. I jump in and listen to a little bit as much as I possibly can with Joey Weaver, one of our old favorites here at Mark Rogers TV. Mike and Joey Weaver with the Basketball Conference podcast as well. And Mike's done a great job filling in for me from time to time and also providing this kind of insight and analysis. So, Mike, anything else you want to tackle?
Real quick, can we talk about Wisconsin?
Absolutely.
So Wisconsin, they have Jonathan Taylor coming back, Heisman Trophy candidate, probably the Heisman Trophy front runner if you had to handicap it right now. The over-under for Wisconsin is sitting at 9.5. comfortably take the over. Wisconsin always seems to win the games they're supposed to win, and they lose a game or two that they're probably supposed to lose. And Wisconsin has a pretty favorable schedule this year, at least to get to 9 wins, and then if they even win one out of their 3 tough games, you get to 10. You look at Wisconsin's schedule: Western Kentucky, New Mexico, and BYU are their first 3 games, and they should go 3-0 in that stretch. They'll be heavily favored in all 3 of those games. If you had to pick one that they might lose, I guess it would be BYU, but Wisconsin should comfortably win that game. They go on the road to Iowa. It's the first game, in my opinion, that they have a really good chance of losing, just because while Wisconsin will be favored against Iowa, they usually beat teams that are tricky on the road, like Iowa. Iowa's very tough to play against at Kinnick, as Penn State saw last year, of course. Ohio State's seen that in the past. Iowa plays teams really, really tough when they're at home. Wisconsin will be one of the top 10 teams in the country when they go to Kinnick in late September. Keep an eye on that game, but Wisconsin usually wins those games that other teams might be on upset alert for. Wisconsin goes on the road to Michigan in mid-October. That'll be a tough game. They go to Happy Valley in November to play Penn State. But outside of that, Wisconsin should be favored, and they might even be favored in a couple of those games I just mentioned. But Wisconsin will be favored in at least 9 or 10 of these football games this year. I like Wisconsin to get to 10 wins, potentially 11. I think they're a threat to make the college football playoff again out of the Big Ten. They were a threat last year until late in the season. Of course, they were undefeated. They got blown out in the Big Ten championship game. I think Wisconsin has a great chance to put themselves in position to make another college football playoff. I think they can get to 10 wins. They really only have 3 tough games on their schedule, and they very rarely get upset. Because of that, I like my chances for Wisconsin to hit the over on 9.5. I like them to get to 10 wins this year. And I know it's always tricky. You don't always want to bet the over on high numbers. I mean, we've already talked about Clemson tonight at 10.5. We've talked about Wisconsin now at 9.5. But when you look at these teams that are supremely talented, well coached, don't get upset a lot, these are the teams you look at to maybe hit those high over totals. So I'm going to take Wisconsin over 9.5. I like them to get to 10 here this year.
All right, everyone. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Probably about 10 to 15% based on the analytics of the people that watch my videos are subscribed to my YouTube channel. I know that you guys love college football. Set your notifications so I don't drive you crazy with notifications, and I'm producing far less videos than I did in the past, so that shouldn't be an issue. We just do the live chats on a regular basis here. So please join us, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the videos you like. You know what? Dislike the videos that you dislike. Just engage in the conversation, join the discussion, the debate, and the analysis, and certainly make suggestions of what you want to hear here at Mark Rogers TV. If you like the audio version, don't want to watch me and Mike, don't want to look at our ugly faces, then you check out the audio on Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher. Just search Mark Rogers TV. Mike, it's always a good time, good discussion, getting ready for college football.
Appreciate it, Mark. Thanks.